Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Asma Akhras was once a demure banker from suburban London, destined for a stellar career in high finance. All that changed when she fell in love with a tall ophthalmologist from Damascus. Mrs. al Assad, also known as the First Lady of Syria, became a beacon of reform, promising economic change and an opening up to the West. But then the Arab Spring erupted and Syria fell into civil war. A decade later, Asma is now accused of war crimes. How did it all come to this? Our guest today is Nicolas Pelham, the Economist's Middle East correspondent. He's recently written a long piece on Asma's rise to infamy. Hello, Nicolas.
Hello, Nicolas. It's good to be with you too.
Yeah, we've got two Nicolases here today. We will thanks very much for joining us. There is a lot to talk about. I know you're just back from Iraq and Syria, so I'm hoping we can get some questions in about that as well. But let's start in Acton, West London. Who was Asma Akhras and how did she come to live there?
It's a sort of fascinating question, because actually when you sort of delve into her past, she hasn't really left much of a trail. She went. Her parents were Syrians, both from a fairly large city, Homs, which is a Sunni city in Syria. Her grandfather her father had come to London on a scholarship to study medicine. Her mother had got a posting at the Syrian embassy. She was sort of well connected because her uncle had been instrumental in the rise of First al Assad. At one point, he'd been an intelligence officer. He'd risen to an interior ministry. So she kind of had these. She was came from Sunni Syrian stock, which had kind of good connections with the Assads. But in London, she was kind of she grew up very much as a Londoner. She was at school. She went to a church school, primary school. She called herself Emma. She then went to Queen's College, a private school just around the corner from her father's practice in Harley Street. And there was nothing about her that really kind of suggested she was destined for anything to do with Syria. In fact, kind of one of the remarkable things about Asma is just kind of, how many different faces she has, and how many different sort of faces, how she's transitioned from one to the other throughout.
She's very good at fitting in, is what you're saying.
She's very industrious. She's very calculating. She's hardworking, ambitious, and she's kind of, in each of these roles, she's kind of, when she went on to King's College, London University, she got a first there. She got a position initially at Deutsche Bank, then at JP Morgan. She never stood out from the crowd in London. In fact, kind of when you speak to colleagues, they really struggle to remember much about her, except that she sort of kept her head down and did her job rather well. There was not, and even kind of people her parents would take her on holidays to Damascus. They might spend the summer there, but really sort of all the people can remember about her when she was there was that she kind of would lounge by the Sheraton poolside. She didn't really wander much into the country beyond that, and didn't seem particularly interested in it.
And she didn't really speak very good Arabic either.
Her parents did speak Arabic at home, but if you listen to even quite recent interviews of her talking Arabic, that there's still quite a lot of umming and erring in that. So her Arabic is improved enormously, but yeah, I mean, this was a really unfamiliar world that she was cast into. Certainly, it was unfamiliar in terms of the family, but then sort of she became part of the Assad family, who still spoke, well, at least the kind of the older generation still spoke with the sort of almost peasant drawl. It was a Syrian dialect, which kind of, I think, just left her stumped much of the time. She was very much an outsider coming into the heart of a regime.
Yeah, and as we said in introduction, she met Bashar in London. He was working there. Was this a love match, or was this something which was constructed?
It's quite hard to know. I mean, the earliest photo that I've seen of them together was when Bashar, who was at that point was the second son, he was he's the only one of 5 children from Hafiz al Assad who went abroad. It really seemed that he kind of didn't want to be initially kind of part of this setup. He was happy to leave the role of sort of effectively Syria as a monarchy and all, but name the role of crown prince to his and successor to his elder brother Basil. He wasn't flamboyant in the way that Basil was. He kind of, his favorite music seems to have been when he was in London was Phil Collins, and he kind of he sort of wanted to, he always seemed to be opting out. And the earliest photo that I've seen of them is kind of of Bashar being received at a sort of reception, apparently at the Syrian embassy in London, very soon after his arrival, sort of in the mid-1990s, I think in 1993 or 4. And you see sort of a very young Asma, who probably about that age, I think was 17, and her mother, who seems to be sort of mistress of ceremonies, sort of pushing her forward to attract the attention of Bashar. And it's not clear how much time they spent together when he was here. There were other women that Bashar was dating. They do seem to have been sort of meeting at a mutual friend, at the large house of a mutual friend in St. John's Wood. But after about 18 months of Bashar's training as an ophthalmologist, he suddenly whisked back to Damascus when his brother dies in a car crash, and he's sort of groomed to be the future leader of Syria. And again, it doesn't seem that they carried on. If there was a relationship at this sort of very young age that Asma was at the time, it doesn't seem that it carried on. He was certainly dating other women, often his kind of brother's cards, and she had seems to have had flings as well with a sort of Scandinavian banker, and there was a Beiruti banker that was quite attracted to her. And then sort of all of a sudden, Bashar becomes president when his father dies in 2000, and it's rather awkward that he's an unmarried bachelor, and they need need to find him a consort. And Asma is by this stage she's a banker into mergers and acquisitions. She's training in Paris and in New York. She's applying for an MBA in Harvard, and all of a sudden she disappears, and she comes back after three weeks of sort of missing from work, saying that she's been in the desert in Libya, and that she's going to live with a dashing Syrian. And so sort of from mergers and acquisitions in JP Morgan, she sort of goes into mergers and acquisitions of Syria, and that's really her path there on in.
Let's just remind ourselves then, because I mean, I think everyone's going to be familiar with the revolution and the civil war and the terrible things that have happened since then. But we do have to remind ourselves that Syria essentially was one of the most despotic or repressive regimes in the Middle East, and that's saying something, isn't it?
At that stage, it probably wasn't the most despotic. Saddam Hussein probably had the title of kind of tyrant par excellence. But yeah, it's a state which is controlled by the secret police, by the Mukhabarat. It's sort of heavily centralized, that any hint of organized opposition is dealt with the sort of utmost severity. People do disappear. People are dependent on permits and permission for the secret police for pretty much everything, even to kind of have a wedding. You need in a hotel, you need a permit, because that would involve a large number of people gathering together, and assembly is of more than a very small number is prescribed. So it's a really tightly controlled state, and this isn't. Asma really didn't know very much about it. She was kind of, and indeed, sort of after her first year of marriage, sort of claims that she spent the kind of, the first year pretty much incognito, going around trying to discover a country that she'd suddenly been cast into.
Yeah, and I mean, think about it. There she was. I mean, really potentially going to, all the doors and banking going to be open for her, being trained in Paris, about to go to Harvard, first class degree. What was to stop her? And she gives all of that up. Let's roll forward a bit.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
She gives it all up. I mean, but she acquires something much bigger. She acquires potentially the kind of, to be effectively sort of queen of of Syria, and she is somebody who is highly ambitious. She doesn't. I guess she saw the opportunities of giving this kind of, what could have been a fast track life in the West up for being sort of potentially number 2 in Syria. And yet when she gets there, she's sort of cast into a very different role. She encounters Bashar's family who are controlling, who are as cruel amongst their own as they are amongst the country at large, and they treat her as they come from a specific clan, from a specific sect, which and from they spent all their lives in Syria, and they see her very much as an outsider who has one role, which is to breed and to create a successor, and they really try and imprison her in that role. She's kind of locked away almost. She wants to be First Lady. They refuse to give her that title. The sort of matriarch of the family, Anissa, Bashar's mother, keeps that role, and she's like a sort of, she's in a cage prison for much of the time, and she dutifully gives birth to 3 children in quite rapid succession. But it seems as if she's very frustrated and sort of about, having thought she was coming in to claim Syria, she feels that she's sort of almost a prisoner in her own realm.
Yeah, you just Anissa Makhlouf, so Bashar's mother, only died in 2016. So that we'll talk a bit more about the Makhloufs in a second. But what kind of hopes were attached to Asma by the West? And I think we're going to bring up Vogue's feature, because I think some people remember that Vogue did this very long feature on her, calling her the Desert Rose, the Rose in the Desert. Here it is. So, and that came out just as the revolution was breaking out and people were being killed and imprisoned en masse. So the timing of that couldn't have been worse. But what kind of hopes were attached to her, and what was she doing in the run up to that?
I mean, this picture we're looking at now is very much her in her third phase. You have the first as the kind of Londoner, the second of her as the kind of the broodmare, the sort of locked away in her home, and she does succeed in breaking out of that. Mainly because of Bashar's failings, and Bashar was initially somebody who the West had attached quite a lot of hope in. He was seen as somebody who was Western educated, English and French speaking, somebody who was attuned to the West, and he went traveling around sort of Western capitals in the early years of his reign. He spoke the language of reform, of both economic and to some degree even political reform, and yet kind of it quickly dawned on Western powers that he wasn't everything that he was trying to crack himself up to be. And I think the first alarm bell started ringing when he was very nervous about, and the regime was very nervous about, the American invasion of Iraq next door, and this mission of the Bush administration to spread democracy across the Middle East. That seemed as if it could ripple into Syria, and to avoid that, kind of Bashar punched back. His counterpunch was to release Islamist radicals from his jails and send them into Iraq to conduct operations against roadside bombings, and essentially sort of lead insurgency against the Americans there. And that kind of made him fall out pretty quickly out of favor with the Americans. He further upset Western capitals when it was seen that Syria was ruling Lebanon when Rafiq al-Hariri, the former prime minister, was assassinated, and was seen as having a hand directly or indirectly in that. So he was Bashar was, having been somebody who was kind of courted, became a pariah, and it was really that at that point he turned to Asma to try and sort of rescue him and become his bridge back to the West. There's a kind of fascinating photo of and footage of Bashar fairly soon after the Harry assassination in 2005, when he's in Rome at the funeral of John Paul II, the Pope, and the Vatican has a policy of not barring anybody from attending its funerals. Bashar is sort of desperately trying to find hands to shake. Nobody will shake his hands, and it falls to Asma to start engaging with the great and the good. And I think at that point he realizes kind of that she can be his bridge back into some degree of acceptance in the West. And so she's very much kind of pushed to the front at that point. She escapes her gilded cage, and launches her own charities and foundations. She has something called the Syria Trust, which sort of it almost becomes like a parallel cabinet, sort of giving orders about sort of opening of museums, and there's a whole sort of program to transform to give Damascus a facelift, to turn it into a sort of into parkland and spruce up its museums. She launches education projects. She tries to launch an economic model involving private banks. Her footprint is really kind of all over the country at that point. And she has her own kind of PR companies in the West who are helping to promote this image of a kind of a couple who are trying to open up Syria to the outside world, and that's where kind of Vogue comes in. And they really had kind of very grandiose plans, right? On the eve of the Arab Spring, they were about to launch a huge sort of tourism gala to turn Syria into a sort of major tourism destination. They managed to attract Hollywood stars and sort of Western pop stars to come to Damascus to give the country to put it on the map. And there were plans for American business delegations. There were plans for Bashar perhaps to go to Washington. It really looked as if this was kind of, the dawn of a new age for Syria and for Bashar and Asma. Then comes the Arab Spring and it all goes a cropper.
I think this is a really fascinating period. I think it's WikiLeaks that published emails from her with a friend in Dubai shortly after, not long into the war. Do you detect a wobble? What do you think was going on at that time? Was there a sense that she didn't want to be there? What do you think was happening?
I think she saw, she saw that all her hopes and her plans were about to be dashed. That kind of, she had this new museum of ideas that she was about to launch, and she'd managed to attract kind of people from the Science Museum in London to come and join her in setting that up. And and all that you're left with is a sort of concrete shell. I think she saw, a whole series of white elephants and castles in the sky that she was going to leave behind. She desperately tried to hold onto those, but it was really a moment of reckoning when those that had tried to constrain her in the early days saw their opportunity to make a comeback. Bashar was left with two choices. Did he listen to the street? Did he listen to the protests? Did he act and try and rein in his regime? Or did he double down? Did he dig in? Did he realize that he could be, and he had repeated warnings from those who are closest to him, particularly from this matriarch, from his mother, Anissa, who said, man up, don't look, remember your father. What did he do when he was faced with a protest and a revolt? He crushed them, he eliminated them, he nipped it in the bud. You've got to do the same or we're all going to go down. And that message.
He actually bombed them with aircraft, didn't he? He actually dropped bombs on, was it Hams and Hummer? Homs and
he flattened it. It was kind of, it was, the cities of Syria today look like Dresden after the Second World War. It's just, they've been flattened. He destroyed his own country in the process, but he was faced with these two choices. He decided, and he embarked on a war that on a policy initially of kind of shooting demonstrators, then lobbing tank shells at them, then, as he said, dropping barrel bombs from the sky, eventually using sort of chemical weapons. And each kind of gradation, he slips ever deeper into a sort of path of no retreat. There is really no kind of no way out. And Asma initially retreats from that. She hides away. She has a little sort of chalet up on the mountain above Damascus, where she seems to be spending an increasing amount of time in the first months. Having been very active on social media, she disappears altogether. The fighting inside Damascus gets very close to their home in al-Malki, and she retreats to Latakia on the coast, and again it's sort of seen as if she's sort of back to that second phase of being contained, locked away. There are offers for her to get out from the British, from the Saudis, some kind of laced with quite hefty sums of finance. She's kind of promised an exit. It appears that on at least two occasions she tries, but her kids are taken away from her at the airport, and she isn't going to abandon her children.
Has that been substantiated? Is that something you've been able? Do you think that's pretty? How much reporting has there been done on that? Because that really, if that's true, that explains a lot. But I don't know how well pinned down that has been, Nicolas.
A lot of it is true. It's circumstantial. It comes from diplomats who are Western diplomats who were in Damascus at the time, who had close ties with her. It comes from Saudis who talk about kind of how they tried to tempt her out. But I think you can also just see it, from statements that are coming out of London. They're quite different from those that are coming out of Brussels, and from the European, from the rest of Europe, which sort of clamp sanctions on her. At that point, William Hague is still saying, she's a British citizen with a British passport, and you can't stop British citizens sort of coming into Britain. So it's kind of, Britain very much left the door open to her. They still had good ties with her father, First Lady of Syria, who led the British Syria Association and had kind of former ambassadors on his British ambassadors to Syria on his board, and sort of others who have some military connections. And so he was, they left the door open. But what's not clear is whether she to what extent she wanted out. And it does seem that there are reports that she was stopped by goons on the way to the airport, and her kids were removed from her. That
at this stage,
I don't think I've got that in chapter and verse, but I've heard it from good.
I have to apologise because my dog sits in on these interviews, and he's
getting impatient.
And normally he's very, very well behaved, but he's about to make an exit just now. So the door behind me is going to open, and the dog is going to walk out. So that's so forgive the distraction. Hang on a second. Actually. But the question I want to ask next was, but then there's this shift, which is from her being in this position of, do I stay, do I go, to essentially becoming, I think we can say, a pretty key part of the regime now. How does that happen?
Yeah. The other factor to why she wanted to act was that it wasn't just the country that was falling apart. It appeared that her marriage was falling apart as well. That there are leaks of emails of Bashar philandering, and at some point she has to decide. Is she going to stay? Is she going to? And how is she? I think she does confront Bashar, and she has a kind of remarkable stroke of good fortune from her point of view. Her kind of two guardians, her two the nemesis inside the family was the mother-in-law, Anissa. She dies in 2016. Bashar's sister, Bushra, who played, who was a very strong influence on Bashar, partly because her husband, Asif Shaukat, was at the heart of the security apparatus. He is killed in a bomb attack inside the kind of command center of the regime in Damascus. There are lots of question marks as to how that happened, but as a result of that, Bushra, the Asma's sister-in-law, flees to Dubai, and so suddenly, kind of having had this kind of lived in a palace where she was very constrained by other relations, she suddenly sort of seems to have the place to herself, and that kind of provides for her relaunch, and she goes through another makeover, which is to really assert herself at the heart of the regime. Initially, sort of going back to her charities, but they reinvent themselves, not as kind of heritage foundations or as educational foundations, but as humanitarian ones. This is by now a system which is deeply strapped for cash, and humanitarian aid is a very powerful source of revenue, but also of knowledge. And so she becomes pretty much the prime interlocutor for the United Nations for distributing aid in much of regime-held Syria, and that gives her, as I said, not just kind of economic clout, but also patronage, influence. She's the one who, her foundation has to get aid in and out. That involves dealing with warlords, both rebel and regime. And that at that point, I think she discovers the power of the war economy. It gives her a kind of foothold into the war economy, and from there on in, she becomes ever more avaricious, ever more sort of and tries to assert herself at the heart of Syria's economy. There's one barrier to that, who is Rami Makhlouf. He is from the Bashar's the maternal side of Bashar's family. She's Anissa's. He's Anissa's nephew, and essentially he had been the sort of economic gateway for the outside world into Syria. He'd been the regime's, had led the regime's economic arm, and you see in recent years, over the last couple of years, there's been a sort of showdown between Asma and Rami Makhlouf for control of the economy, in which Asma has come out on top. She takes over his charities initially, where he was kind of providing for the Alawites, who are the sort of political and military base of the regime. She's very involved in supporting the families of those who've died fighting in the war, again, many of whom are Alawite. So she starts to kind of peel away some of the kind of regime's base, and become the kind of chief financier.
And ultimately, Remy finds himself stripped of things like the telecoms company, his bank accounts closed. He becomes more or less powerless.
Yeah, I mean, Rami Makhlouf, by some estimates, had control over, he and his conglomerates had control over half the Syrian economy. They ran Syriatel, the main telecom company, and also MTN. They had shares in that. Pretty much anything that if you want to get in and out of Syria or do any business there, he was the address, and she becomes that address and the kind of circle around her. And if you want to do business now in Syria, you need to be part of or have connections to her immediate circle.
Let's expand the conversation a bit now and talk about Syria more generally. And what I'd like to do now is bring in questions from people. So everyone, if you could start putting your questions in the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand side, if you're on your laptop, but maybe elsewhere on your screen. And then we can start putting those questions to Nicolas.
Yeah. Can I just, sorry, just to finish this story, there's a really interesting question about where Asma wants to go next. She certainly seems to be at the climbed as to the top economically. There is a question mark as to whether she could go further still. She's very ambitious. She sees herself as, I think, more competent than her husband, and Syria is a kind of monarchy, and as I was saying, in all but name, that she would like to elevate her son to ensure perhaps that he is a successor. But there have also been some who suggest that she might aspire to that top job as well. You've got presidential elections in Syria coming up next month. Bashar probably is going to be the prime contender, but there are some who are suggesting that if he was looking for an exit from this quagmire that Syria has become, could she be that potential address which would allow him essentially to continue behind the scenes? There's sort of some who draw comparisons to sort of what Putin did in Russia, given kind of Putin's influence over Syria. It's not a particularly far-fetched comparison, that perhaps he could continue to rule through her, that she could have that titular role. It'd be a way of the regime telling the outside world that power had shifted to a Sunni. It'd be a way of saying that they were kind of part of a progressive front, which they liked claim by handing power to the first female ruler in the Middle East for centuries, if not millennia. And remarkably, in recent months, what we've seen is kind of is Asma's picture going up along in much the same way as Bashar's, covering kind of the full frontals of the fronts of buildings in her parents' hometown of Homs. Ministers have started putting her picture on there next to Bashar's on their coffee tables when they receive visitors. She's suddenly playing a kind of political role, which is sort of unprecedented for any. It's a role that, although Anissa Bashar's mother called herself First Lady, she was very much a kind of behind the scenes operator. Asma is very, she's on the news, at the front and top of bulletins in state-controlled media. She's on the presidential website almost as much, if not more, than Bashar. She's really very visible, and that is begging the question amongst the chattering classes, among Syrian chattering classes in exile, but also in Damascus, as to where does she want to go next.
And does she have a more pivotal role now than the point when the conflict was driven by military forces? Now, I guess Syria now has retaken most of the territory that it lost during the war. The war, by and large, has subsided, and I guess it's the rebuilding, the economic pressure is the most intense thing that the regime has to deal with. And I guess, does that put her in a more central role than previously was possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely right that Bashar has won back most of the territory, but it's a really Pyrrhic victory. It's a broken country that is kind of even more desperate now than it was at the height of the fighting. It doesn't have the currency has collapsed to sort of record lows. I think it was $1 was worth about 50 Syrian pounds at the start of the war. It's now down to 3,000 or 4,000. Syrians, there isn't enough bread on the street. There are huge queues for bread. There's no real source of petrol supply. So that's really intermittent, and there are vast queues for petrol. Prices have skyrocketed. People who are middle class are now very poor. And many are going hungry. So, and it's not clear how the people at the top are still comfortable. They still control. They can still get rents from checkpoints and from border controls and from fleecing their own population and from charging for permits and charging for evading the draft. And but it's a really predatory regime, and it's not clear long-term kind of what Bashar's vision is, other than just sitting tight and survival. And I suppose in some ways that does give Asma a role. She's been put on the sanctions list in the West, but she still has much better ties in the West through her family and than he does. And that and she's probably more imaginative than he is. She understands more about economics, but yeah, quite how even she could dig the country out of the hole, out of this hole. She's very much associated with a regime that is. She's become part and parcel of a regime which has led to the killing of 500,000 Syrians, to the devastation of its cities, to the flight of half its population, either internally or in case of kind of millions abroad. This is a smashed place, and she is she is part of the making of that Syria.
Right. Well, we've got some questions coming in now. We've got Simon Jackson first, and then I think we've got Tim Ripley as well, waiting in the wings, from Tim Ripley, who writes for Jane's Defence. So let's bring in Simon Jackson to start with. Go ahead, Simon.
Good morning. Part of the tagline for this was whether she's possibly a war criminal. Is that by association, or is just by association with the rest of the regime, or is anything particularly heinous down to her?
So that was my next question, Nicolas, was to talk about the Guernica 67 chambers and the accusations that they've sent to the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah, she is at the pinnacle of this regime. Does she have directly kind of blood on her hands? No, but then is she giving military orders? No. Is she in control of the security apparatus? No. I mean that, but she is working and promoting kind of warlords who are kind of who have ground Syria into this broken country that it is, and have been part and parcel of the kind of the killing and the torture, and she's facilitating that.
So I guess the question there is a legal one, isn't it? Because you talk about command responsibility. You know, if you're part of the regime, I don't know. I mean, how do you say that she was involved in decisions that led to people's deaths, or do you say that she didn't do enough to prevent those deaths? I mean, we're getting into sort of quite specific legal areas here, I guess.
She is part of that whole process of empowerment, of criminality, of a war machine that is that has chased sort of millions of Syrians out of the country, that prevents them from returning, that is taking their kind of property, and so I think she's very much stood by the regime, and as it, at least since 2015-14, since at the height of the killing. So and she's very much the owner, I think, the owner of that process today. So to that extent, again, I'm not. I don't think I'm legally qualified. What I think you can say is that she's facilitating that process, and she's keeping it going, and she's enabled the regime to carry out the crimes that it has.
Right. Okay. Let's bring in Tim Ripley. I'll come back to those allegations in a second. And Simon, I think I'll just try and find out also as well what it's Guernica 37. Sorry. Detail in the allegations, and bring that back up if we can. Tim, you've got a question. Go ahead, Tim.
Nick, Syrian regime survives largely because of its alliance with Russia. How does she fit into that relationship with President Putin and the Russian government and the Russian intervention in Syria?
It's a very good question. It's quite a difficult question to answer, because you hear many different, because you get very different answers when you speak to people who are kind of intimately involved with the regime. I think the kind of I think a lot of it comes down to actually how you view Russia's role in Syria. Is it to what extent is it fed up with Bashar? Does it believe that Bashar can't deliver, or does it fear that kind of there really is and I suppose to how fed up with Bashar is Putin. He's somebody who has been very resistant to any call on him to reform. The Russians have tried to promote some form of constitutional model, which Damascus has resisted. One of the reasons why I think you've seen the announcement of elections in Syria, presidential elections in Syria, come so late is because Russia had yet to give Bashar a green light to stand. It's a country which is bankrupt, which has huge debt, owes Russia huge debts, and which really doesn't have very much to offer Russia in terms of kind of economic any repayment for the salvation that it provided the regime. And I think it all came to a head with the fall of Rami Makhlouf. A lot of the Makhlouf empire had been in cahoots with Moscow. A lot of Rami Makhlouf's own family had a lot of them were living in Moscow. A lot of the assets seem to be held there. They still seem to be there, but it's quite hard to see how Rami himself could have fallen without some form of green light from Russia. And I suppose it's the reason why it's a difficult answer is that you also hear kind of allegations that she's working quite closely with some of Iran's men on in Syria as well, and there's obviously kind of playoff between Russia and Iran. My sense is that she's managed to take Rami's empire, much of Rami's empire in Syria. She hasn't yet managed to gain control outside. That is still probably why Rami Makhlouf is alive, because he has the passwords and the keys to those assets abroad. And she's done things like, she's hosted Russian delegations, she's hosted Russian ministers. I think that she's still kind of carving out her own path. I don't think that she's become kind of Russia's interlocutor, prime address in Syria.
I'd love to get some more questions coming in. Tim, if you've got a follow-up questions, by all means. The more general question I had was about the overall war. And if you think about Russia, if you think about Iran, who's benefited? Who's got the most out of this conflict? They both stepped in. Iran sent in troops. They brought in troops from Lebanon, from Hezbollah. A lot of blood was lost. A lot of money was spent. Who's gained from it?
Economically, Syria is no longer really an opportunity. I think that it's really hard to see how Syria Syria's gained absolutely nothing. It's a country which is quartered. It's sort of been hung, drawn, and quartered. It's parceled out between the main foreign players in Syria. And I suppose, although economically there's not really much to be gained from Syria, strategically and territorially, there is quite a lot. Russia has more, has secured its military base on the Mediterranean in warm waters. It's got air bases all over the country. So it's increased its strategic depth. Iran has increased its strategic depth. Its kind of dream of reaching the Mediterranean, which dates back centuries to Safavid times, has really been fulfilled. Now it's got a bridge that extends through Iraq, through its kind of Assad and the Shia militia forces in Iraq, through Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is really the prime force in that country. But then there are others who've got very strong footholds in Syria as well. The Turks have increased their now control large swathes along. They've got a buffer along their southern border. They've got control really of Idlib province. So they've gobbled up parts of the country, and then in the northeast you've got an American presence which still survives, still provides an umbrella for Kurds, and has an autonomous zone that increasingly looks which is sort of made strides standing on its standing up its forces on the ground. So you have this kind of division of the country, a partition of Syria, and the longer the stabilization sort of, you've also got violence which is sort of ebbed dramatically, and sort of you've got stabilization agreements between all the various external players. And the longer these stabilization agreements hold, I think the longer you see some sort of longer term partition of Syria. It's really quite hard to see how Syria reconnects and reestablishes itself as a united country, despite the lip service that all parties play to that. Okay. So all parties have gained something. I think it's really hard to see how anybody internally has gained much, except for those at the very top. Perhaps that's my sort of first and foremost.
We've got another 10 minutes, so please do put your questions in the Q&A box. I'm just going to read, coming back to what Simon Jackson was asking. This is a statement from Toby Cadman, the founder of Guernica 37, that have sent that file to the Metropolitan Police. What she's suspected of doing is having incited acts that have resulted in death in Syria, meeting with troops, making public statements, glorifying conduct of the army that has resulted in 500,000 deaths, and use of chemical and other forms of banned weapons. It's not just that she is the wife of the president. Our allegations are that she has actively campaigned and actively participated in those crimes, and so she must face justice, he says. It doesn't actually say exactly what campaigns or how exactly she's actively participated in those crimes. It doesn't make it more specific than that. Nicolas, you're back from Iraq as well, so I want to take the opportunity just to draw things up. We had a very interesting session about 4 or 5 weeks ago when we were talking about southern Iraq and the Shia militias. What were you able to assess there? What do you see as the conflict between Iran and the US within Iraq?
It was my first visit to Iraq in about 18 months. Sort of on my previous visit, I think that there was an anti-Iranian sentiment was quite strong, but it wasn't universal. And what I found astonishing on this visit was just that the kind of anti-Iranian sentiment now was kind of universal. It was, I couldn't. I kept looking for a voice that would come out, and argue the case for Iran, and I couldn't find it.
Can we just remind ourselves what's been happening in the last year? We talked about the assassinations that were taking place, the rise of the Shia and IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard groups that are backing these Shia militia in the south, but also throughout Iraq, and the toll that they've had. We had a program that looked at the assassination of Hisham I'm going to get his name muddled up.
Hashemi, yeah.
Hashemi. Also other human rights activists and politically people who are opposed to Iran. And so quite a sort of an appalling record and one of huge intimidation for Shia and Sunni alike. So that was what we were looking at last time. And you're saying that there's now this universal animosity towards Iran because of this. And I guess my question is, what if does that stop there? I mean, Iran has got a great platform in Iraq. Is that being undermined? That we saw the assassination of Soleimani, the key Revolutionary Guard leader, by the Americans in a missile attack, and they were bent on revenge. So I'm just trying to get a sense of where that conflict is going.
So you're absolutely right. You've got a very weak state in in Iraq, which has struggled to establish itself, even kind of 16 years on from the American effort to construct it. And it was kind of ripe for infiltration, and Iran has done a very good job of trying to establishing its levers of influence politically, militarily, economically. Iraq is, I think, its largest trading partner now in the region. It's been a source of kind of dollars and hard currency for a country which has been under sanctions throughout the Trump era, and with kind of but since the assassination of the killing of Qasem Soleimani, it's kind of struggled to find a replacement. And sorry, there's a sense that kind of that all its that he was the address for and the orchestrator of so much of Iran's project in Iraq, and without him, that project is showing signs of fragmentation. You've got new militias doing their own thing, not sort of the PMF, which is supposed to be a kind of an umbrella, the Popular Mobilization Force for the various militias, doesn't exercise the control that it used to. You've got groups that are sort of popping off missiles at Saudi Arabia. You've got others that are focusing on Syria. It's it hasn't lost any of its arsenal, but it has lost some of its strategy. And I think that there's a sense that it is now much more on the defensive. You've got a prime minister whose backing depends on Muqtada Sadr, who controls one of the largest militias. He's a kind of he's a cleric that used to fight the Americans, but as he becomes ever more part and parcel of the kind of state, his main control the central bank and the director of the ports and many of the ministries and the prime minister's office. So it kind of increasingly looks as if he has the whip hand in Iraq, and he's made at least a kind of public presence of trying to confront Iran. And he catches that as kind of confronting all foreign forces. But when it comes to, there's been a new renegotiation of America's military presence in Iraq. He has given his blessing to that. When you've got militias that are attacking the American embassy or American bases, he kind of calls out those who are attacking and offers his own militia, Saraya Salam, the peace brigades, to come to their defense. So you've kind of got forces which are coalescing to confront Iran, and ahead of elections which is scheduled for October, you might see the emergence of a new alliance in which you've got sort of remarkably three components, sort of Sunni, Shia and Kurd. The Shia being Muqtada Sadr, the Kurds being the KDP under the Barzanis, the Sunnis under the Speaker of Parliament, Al-Busi, forming. This is yet to formally take hold, but it appears that all of these three forces are coalescing into a united body, which could actually be a force which leans much closer to America and seeks to, in the name of regaining Iraqi independence and sovereignty, roll back Iran's presence in Iraq. It's by no means certain that that's the way that the alliances are going to go in the election, and it probably won't be the election that determines that. It'll be all the jostling for positions after the election. But I don't, Iran is still trying to put together a Shia house involving all the various Shia parties, which has sort of been in power since 2005. And been running the government, and it's not clear that that's where the future politically you could see a very different map emerge after the next elections.
Right. We've got time just for a very brief question. This is from Hilary Matthews. Go ahead, Hilary. This is back to the Assads. Go ahead, Hilary.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just would like to know whether Asma or Assad dynasty has got billions stashed in London that is supporting them.
Go on, Nicolas.
Now I've tried. I've really tried to delve into this. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a smoking gun or a kind of aura that I produce to show that that's the case. It's remarkable how her father, the father-in-law of the Syrian president, is still living in a really sort of modest pebble dashed 2 up, 2 down with kind of weeds in the on the garden path. He certainly makes a show of that kind of that modesty. He has a sort of reputation of being tight, and indeed many Syrians are, because of the instability in the country, they're not like the Lebanese. They're not flamboyant. They don't flaunt their wealth. But if he is hiding away billions, he's done a very good job of it.
I think there we're going to leave it. Thank you very much indeed, Nicolas. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. I think it's given us a great insight into the regime, a different take on the history of the last 10 years, and certainly a fascinating account of Asma al Assad. My thanks to Nicolas Pelham. Thank you very much.